Well, hello everyone. My name is Christina and I want to give you a warm welcome to the final session of our Strategy for Safety series, proudly brought to you by myosh and FEFO Consulting. It's been such a fantastic journey so far, looking at how to ignite your safety identity, then how to build and win by aligning strategy, people and power. And now we wrap up with one of the most critical pieces of the puzzle, how we measure what actually matters. Now, in today's session, we will explore how to move beyond traditional lag indicators and start tracking the inputs and drivers that truly impact safety performance. We're joined again by Mark Wright, founder and director of FEFO Consulting, who's been guiding us through this series with clarity, insight, and passion. And joining him today is Adam Jackson, head of health, safety, and environment at JLL. Adam brings incredible experience leading HSE strategy in complex global environments. And today he will share how a sharp focus on the right measures can shape culture, drive accountability, and support continuous improvement. Now, together, Mark and Adam will unpack the difference between OKRs, KPIs, and when and how to use each. And more importantly, how to involve your people in creating a feedback-rich environment that drives some real change. Of course, as always, we want to hear from you. So please jump into that chat box throughout the session, share your ideas, ask your questions, and connect with others in the safety space. We'll cover as many of the questions as we can during the session. And if there's time at the end, we'll have a little Q&A. So this is your chance to tie it all together, strategy, leadership, and meaningful measurement to build a safety system that delivers. I'll hand it over to you now, Mark.
Thank you, Christina, and thanks, Adam, for joining us. Adam's certainly well qualified to join us today, particularly in his recent role with JLL with a really big focus on strategy. It's also really interesting feedback we've been getting over the last couple of weeks running these webinars. There has been a fair bit of interest around strategy. And I think today in particular, as we talk around measurements, it's also very topical at the moment, not only because of the time in the financial year for some organisations that are pulling together their strategy for the next financial year coming, but Safe Work Australia have also recently retired their lost time injury frequency rate calculator. So we'll talk a bit about that today as well. And look, it might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but if there's one key message I wanted to focus on today for the audience is not to start with KPIs. I think it's really easy to go straight to the goal or straight to the KPI. And I know we're talking around goals and metrics today, but yeah, it's really important to start with the strategy first, not the KPI. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and explain why throughout the session today. So just quickly, a little bit about FEFO. We've got consultants scattered around most capital cities in Australia. We work with boards, senior leaders around strategy, leadership development, and a whole range of different generalist health, safety, and environmental topics. We've done a bit of work with JLL and Adam over the last couple of years on and off. I mean, apart from being a really respected safety professional in the field, Adam's also a really good friend. So again, thanks, Adam. I really appreciate your support here.
Thanks, Mark. Back at you, mate. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone. In terms of just a quick introduction for JLL, you can see a bit about the size and scale of our operation on the slide, but I want to kind of hark back to a couple of points that Todd made in the first webinar around knowing your identity and your purpose and vision. And one thing that's great about JLL is that our purpose is to shape the future of real estate for a better world. And in the Asia Pacific market, our aim is to create places for the good of people and planet. And those are two kind of taglines that I love to share with people, because when it comes to the topic of safety strategy, if you can't kind of find a direction and a set of objectives that align with that purpose and mission, you're probably not trying hard enough, because there's so much inherent safety and well-being and care and commitment intonation throughout that mission and purpose. So yeah, that's a little bit about us.
Great, thank you, Adam. So a little bit of a recap on the last webinar. Adam just made reference to the first webinar, but the the second webinar really focused on how to win. That was on the back of the conversation that I had with Todd on webinar 1 around purpose, vision, and where to play. Both Rachel and Nicole spoke a lot about how to win after being a little bit clear on where you're playing. And interestingly, 67% of organisations generally fail to execute their strategy, and there's lots of reasons for that. But just a real recap on some of the discussions had last week. After being really clear on where you want to play, it's also really important not to try and conquer all at once, being really clear on what specific things you're going to keep doing, stop doing, and start doing, with the view that we all don't have an endless sea of resources. And to really effectively execute the strategy well, you need to deploy the resources that you do have as effectively as possible. So part of doing that is having a really clear method around supply and demand, or your capacity and capability. I know that as a small business, we're often pausing our strategy because we just don't have the right capacity to get stuff done. So part of my role is to get move the barriers out of the way where possible, know when to pause, know when to start, know when to stop, and really arranging the resources in a way that our organisation is thriving as much as possible with the resources that we do have that have the biggest impact. And then the same concepts could be true for most organisations, whether you're talking about general business strategy or health and safety. Nicole and Rachel also spoke a little bit about a business case and having a commercial acumen as a health and safety professional. There's one thing to be an SME expert, but there's another thing to actually get stuff done and get organisations and senior management on board with respect to deploying the resources that you need to get your strategy executed effectively. And then lastly, they spoke a little bit about ownership and accountability to really drive and support that effective implementation. So I haven't asked you, Adam, but did you have a chance to listen to the second webinar?
I did, mate, yeah. And look, this slide's a great summary. I think what we're talking about, and this was touched on in the previous webinars, is about making decisions. And, in a business, we can't be all things to all people. We need to choose exactly what it is we focus on, and that's going to be driven by what it is we're trying to achieve. And that means that there's a cost, both good and bad, because some things are going to get left on the cutting room floor, and we're making that choice because we believe in a better outcome that we're trying to drive. And that's really exactly the content we're hoping to cover today, around exactly how we set objectives and then measure our results against those.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, as mentioned, we'll focus on 3 key areas: OKRs, KPIs, and then what that means in terms of actually reflecting, learning, and improving. At the end, we've also got a few free resources we can provide with QR codes and downloads and things for the people on the call that might be interested. So look, before we get kick-started, we often start with a poll, but we're going to do something different today. And Christina, I might need your help here too, because I can't always see the chats, given that I'm presenting.
No, that's all good.
We are keen to hear from the audience today around alternatives that might have to lost time injuries as a measure. Noting that's a little bit topical at the moment, with Safe Work retiring the lost time injury frequency rate calculator.
So I've popped that in the chat. So if everybody or anybody would like to add their 2 cents in there. Anne has come back saying near misses. Total lost days from Nicole. Risk control measures implemented by Anne again. And near miss and hazards by Tracy. Serious injury frequency rates, recovery time. A member from the FMS group says they are measured against TRI, not LTI. Severity rate, RTW hours. David's asked, does there need to be an alternative? And DART, which is days away, restricted duties, and transfer to other areas, plus lead data. What are your thoughts on them?
Covering the whole spectrum, aren't they, Mark? Really, I'm delighted personally seeing them come in, because we're going to touch on most of these areas in some of the things we're going to talk about today. Yeah, I guess over to you, Mark, but I think it's interesting to see just the broad spectrum of, what we might call like reactive or lag measures, and then we've got a mix of lead measures in there as well, and a whole spectrum of metrics that are being suggested.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a bit of a cliche, but some people say you shouldn't measure what you can't measure. So, we can get caught up in trying to measure everything. There are some alternatives, and I certainly believe there's no silver bullet. Having a balanced scorecard, if you like, often is a nice way to make sure you're covering off all bases, which is commensurate, hopefully, with your strategy. So look, we've mentioned already the previous webinars. They are available online and on our own blog and the myosh website as well. If people are interested, they can go back and have a quick look. So there is a free download here. We'll show the QR code again at the end. And for those that have listened to the previous webinars, we've basically gone from 0 all the way through to number 5 in terms of the general steps we've been talking about around how to both develop and execute an effective health and safety strategy. So we'll be focusing on the measurement piece, the back end, and hopefully tying that back into some of the concepts we spoke about in webinar 1 and 2.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of paint the picture for everyone that really what we're talking about here is return on investment. So we spoke a moment ago about how strategy is a series of decisions that we make. Today, it's about what's the return on that, and it's an important conversation to be able to have with your business leaders. It's going to shape the relationship that you have with your CEOs or your CFOs or whoever it is that you work with, because this is how you are going to be able to articulate that all this investment is steering us in the right direction. Thanks, Mark.
So with respect to objectives and key result areas, also known as OKRs, we're going to be talking a little bit about how that might play out from a health and safety perspective. The term OKR, I mean, it's been around for a little while, but it's fair to say it's probably not used a hell of a lot in the health and safety industry. And I actually think it needs to be used more, not less. I think some people have an over-reliance on KPIs and metrics, albeit they have a role to play. So we're going to talk a little bit around how organisations might want to use OKRs in their business. Before we do that, though, I do have a little video to share. So I'm going to just convert this to video mode and play this short little clip.
As soon as he said, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems, I think people stopped thinking about goals. And he made a really great argument, which was everybody at the start line of the 100-meter race has the same goal. It's to win. So it's not the person who has the best goals, it's the person who has the best systems and preparation.
So if you recall, one of the take-home messages today is not to start with a KPI and get too caught up on a KPI, but to start with this strategy first. And that's a really good example of trying to differentiate to win, not based on a KPI or a goal that everyone else might have. And the other analogy that we've got on the screen here is someone driving a car. I think you can really get caught up on, the oil pressure, the fuel gauge, the temperature, etc., and you can lose sight of your destination and the journey of where you need to go if you're getting too bogged down on metrics. Sometimes metrics go up and down for various reasons, and they're called an indicator for a reason. They're just an indicator. Now, I've been in organisations and we've stuck to the strategy, and the KPIs have actually gone in a worse direction initially. But we've stuck to the strategy knowing that the KPIs will come back if we stick to the right strategy. So yes, they're an indicator and yes, they're important, but it's really important, I think, to be clear on your strategy and where you're going first and use the indicators as an indicator. Adam, did you have anything else you wanted to add on that one too?
Look, I do love that analogy. I guess what it immediately evokes for me is the concept that you can be driving 100 miles an hour for as long as you like, but if you're going in the wrong direction, ultimately is a big waste of time. So that's why we need to start with that roadmap and a destination in mind, and that's the journey that we go on. So yeah, I completely agree with your version of events there, Mark, and what you've just described.
So we'll talk a little bit more now around what that might look like and how you might use it in your organisations too. So we've touched on the difference between an OKR and a KPI, but essentially the OKR really is the input and the supporting objectives that support your strategy around who you are, what you want to do, and how you're going to win. The KPIs are the targets, the goals, those things that you track as an indicator to get there. Usually the OKRs then inform your KPI. So there's no point in having a bunch of KPIs that are there just as an indicator, just for a good news story, but they're not supporting your strategy on who you are, where you want to play, and how you're going to win. So to get the OKRs to be effective, it's really important to consider, well, what does make a good OKR? So these concepts around OKRs, I mean, it's well documented that Google, LinkedIn, Intel, and a bunch of other organizations have been using OKRs for a very long time. And they use these OKRs as a bold statement to say, this is where we want to be, and this is how we're actually going to turn the dial to be a bigger and better organization to support our strategy. They need to be objective, they need to be specific, and they need to be aligned with where your organization's going. Often within the ISO standards and a lot of management systems that safety professionals are usually very well versed in, they talk about having a set of objectives and targets. So this sort of plays into this concept a bit, but it goes a step further. And hopefully if you've got the front end of your strategy right, you'll end up with the right objectives and the right OKRs to support that direction.
Yeah, and Mark, I'd like to give an example if I may be so bold. We set an objective inside of JLL a couple of years ago to become better at learning. And particularly, we were able to focus on learning from what goes wrong at that point in time. We're still trying to get better at learning from what goes right. But that objective set us on a mission to do investment into the way we manage incidents, which I'm sure a lot of people listening to the call have had a similar challenge. And what that led us to is investing in the systems and technology and the processes that we wrap around the incident management process. Obviously, the training and competency and capability of our people and associated certifications, and a number of these initiatives that were part of our strategy towards that particular objective. Now, our incident management workflow has a couple of key points in it. And what we were able to do over time is start to bundle together those points to aggregate up an overall score for the quality of our incident management. So we wound up with effectively two dashboards. We wound up with all of the insights that we get out of incident management in terms of, what types of incidents we're having and where and things like that. But then we also had a data quality score that sat behind that. And if that score sat at 100%, it meant we had full confidence in every insight we were getting out of the other dashboard. So the purpose of this story is really to describe how we started with an objective, and over time and through a series of initiatives and objectives, we're able to create a new KPI for our business, which was 100% data quality on our incident management. And that strategy and that objective took us on a journey over time to have that new metric for our business.
Yeah, brilliant. And look, I think it's also fair to say is that you can have a KPI that supports specifically an OKR, but you can also have an OKR without any supporting metric either. Without any supporting KPI, I should say. And we'll talk a little bit more around what that might look like in terms of actually tracking an OKR without necessarily having a specific KPI like Adam just described too. I'll just unmute myself. This is an example of how organizations can use objectives in an OKR sense to cascade it through the organization. Now, obviously this is very situational and every organization and industry is slightly different, but conceptually at least, one error some organisations make is they'll set an objective and they'll cascade that same objective through the whole organisation. So every level of the organisation has the exact same objective, which in some cases might work. Alternatively, this method here talks around how you can cascade those OKRs. So your organisational objective and then the respective key result areas to support that then become the team objective, and then so on and so forth down to the individuals. So what it means is that you're getting a little bit more granular, you're getting a little bit more specific, and you're getting a lot more relevant to things that actually are useful for the respective individuals and teams, but then aggregated up all along with where the organisation is going as a whole. An example of what that might look like in terms of tracking and measurement. We've worked with some organisations around both strategy development, deployment, and helping them support the tracking of those OKRs. For some organisations, they don't like to put a number next to it because people get too caught up on the number and arguing over and debating over a number. Other organisations use it as a really good way to really just keep a good temperature gauge on how they're tracking, either through numbers or a colour traffic light system. So what this is doing is focusing the attention on what matters to your organisation the most, your strategy, the objectives, and where you're going, without necessarily having to have a KPI for those respective activities that you're doing. Adam, have you had much experience in deploying similar things, either with JLL or other organisations?
Yeah, look, we do use the Net Promoter Score in a couple of different contexts, but in the area of cascading goals, there's an example I can share with you, which is a few years ago, JLL was doing a bit of a restructure or reorganization, as we tend to do every few years. And as part of that, we launched a new safety vision. And a key objective for us at that time was obviously to communicate that to the business and then build competency and awareness in what our safety vision, our safety culture is. So JLL deployed a training workshop globally. They set targets around obviously completion rates for people, but some of the important kind of idiosyncrasies about this is it was a trainer-led session. So it had to be led by someone within the JLL business, an internal trainer who needed to be an approved trainer based on completing a train the trainer course. So we had to, before we rolled this training out, embark on a huge undertaking of getting people all around the world educated in how to deliver this training and try and roll it out to the business. So obviously the main target was completion rate. We had a percentage number of headcount that we wanted to go through that training, but some of the other key results that were really interesting to us were obviously the number of trainers that would come out of each location or each part of the business, different business units, which was an indicator of who's willing to invest time and resources into becoming trainers. But also once a trainer appeared, how many then other trainers did they on board to then be able to deliver that training throughout their business? And what we started to get a sense of was how well we permeated that safety culture throughout the business, because this initial batch of trainers, and let's say we started with maybe 20 people, that eventually became hundreds and thousands around the world because they took that message and spread it out. So yeah, that goal cascaded throughout the organization. We started with every business unit needing to provide a percentage of their headcount to become initial trainers, but then we're able to watch that organic growth over time through tracking those different metrics.
Yeah, brilliant. And for those people that are interested in a simple little tool, we've got a QR code there. Feel free to download a little spreadsheet. Just an example of how you might want to track your own OKRs over time. So Christina, a quick poll. We are keen to hear from the crowd, in particular around which organisations are involving their operations to monitor and report on WHS OKRs. So not KPIs, the objectives that sit within your strategy. Are you actually checking to see how effective you're deploying those strategic objectives in your organisation with your operations?
So everybody should see that poll launched on their screen. So if you could all take the time to answer that for us. So far, the majority is saying no. We'll wait for a few more people to add their responses. Still, the majority is at no. We've got 70%, 72 versus 28%. Is that what you're used to seeing?
Yeah, it is. It's not surprising and uncommon. I think, as I've sort of alluded to in the past, I think it's really easy to get caught up and overinvest time and effort in looking at KPIs as opposed to the OKRs. And I think, and I'm guilty of this myself, sometimes you monitor things in isolation within your own little safety function, as opposed to truly engaging the operations and the people that actually matter most in terms of how you're tracking.
So the results, I've closed that poll off now, but the results came in at 72% saying no, 27% saying yes. Before I let you keep going, Tanya mentioned that she wasn't able to download that spreadsheet. So what I'll do, Tanya, is include that in the link that goes out to everybody after this and make sure that it's able to be downloaded for you all then.
Right, now I apologise for that. We'll make sure that's updated too.
Just don't do it again, please.
Sorry, boss.
Carry on.
Right, so let's get stuck into some KPIs then. I know I've suggested we shouldn't start with KPIs, but they do play a role, and we've got a stack of really cool examples that Adam and I have sort of come up with to share some learning today. So this is super interesting. I'm not going to go into the theory behind the Hendrick model, but for those who are familiar with it, it's a little outdated, and I think to many respects it has the potential to drive the wrong behaviour, in particular focusing on the more trivial injuries that happen more frequently, as opposed to how effective your controls are around high potential incidents and things that actually matter the most. Fast forward, we've did a quick pilot chat GPT search, and this is again something that we're seeing a lot of even today with many organisations, is that many organisations are still using injury classification to describe their risk matrix or the consequence parameter of how they're managing risk, fraught with danger. So unfortunately, it looks like as an industry, we still haven't progressed 100 years later around really focusing on how we look at risk and metrics in an effective way. And Adam, I know you've got a bit of a story here, so I'll let you sort of bring this to life around why these concepts are a little bit flawed.
Thanks, Mark. No, I appreciate that. And look, what ChatGPT has given us looks exactly like almost every risk matrix I've ever seen. So not surprised to see that's what the technology thinks. Look, a story that I can share is, within JLL, we still have a need for a risk matrix. I know there's this kind of contrasting viewpoints on that, but we have an operational purpose and a sense of what it does for us. But a small change that we are making that is helping rationalize this a little bit and change our thinking is your traditional matrix looks at consequence and likelihood to arrive at an outcome. And we're in the process of swapping likelihood for the definition of vulnerability. And we consider that based on a number of things. Obviously, likelihood is part of it. How reasonable do we think it is that this might happen on any given day? But also, as part of that assessment, we're trying to factor in the innate experience and competence, experience processes that are all part of our day-to-day delivery as part of that. So we can look at the same risk in different contexts and say, no, okay, the risk's a risk, but we're wrapped up with the right level of control and we have the right competence and we have all the right tools in our box and we feel like we're okay with this, versus a situation that might be a scope creep. We've moved out of our wheelhouse and we're into the realms of uncertainty. And that changes the matter. But the important thing is that we're incorporating that language around having positive indicators as part of the assessment at all times. And that's kind of changing away from focusing solely on the injury, if you like, and more around the presence of capabilities.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And I think having a consequence descriptor that is based on an injury classification is fraught with danger, because often the difference between an LTI and an MTI is luck, rather than focusing on the potential for consequence. So you could be on the top of a ladder without any sort of fall protection, or top of an asset of some description without fall protection and have no injury classification. But the potential consequence is obviously fatal. So really focusing your risk descriptors there on things that matter, again, is super important, particularly as you start to use that as an indicator for success. So what does make a good KPI? So obviously not all KPIs are going to have all of these attributes, and we'll talk around a bit of a balanced approach in a second, but having a good mixture of both evidence and opinion-based KPIs provides, I believe, a really good indication of where you're or how you're tracking as an organisation. So having some really predictive, valid and statistically reliable data helps with benchmarking. It helps tracking things over time and becomes a little bit more objective rather than being purely opinion-based and subjective. Notwithstanding that, not all things are an exact science, black and white. So having some KPIs that are a little bit more opinion-based around what's important to your organisation, are functional and clear, also provides a little bit more clarity on how things are tracking. And I know this all sounds a little bit theoretical at the moment, so we're going to sort of push some of these concepts into some case studies in a second, and I guess give some practical examples of how this might be applied for your organisation. So to do that, we're going to, I guess, give reference to the Construction Research Safety Alliance out of Canada. They're doing some really cool stuff. It's a couple of years old now, but I really like some of the research they've done around really what makes effective metrics. And this is applying what we've just described to show how you can have a bit of a balanced approach around metrics. So if we take the example of something's very objective and clear, I mean, injury rates, for all their faults, they're objective and clear. Usually, so I know sometimes you can play around with the definition of some injuries, but in fact, it is usually quite objective, where you can make them objective and clear around when someone's injured and when they're not. Obviously, they're not always very predictive, and they're not always valid as a measure of success around your health and safety performance. So in terms of getting a little bit more validity, I should say, and things that are a bit more functional, focusing your attention on potential consequence, as we described before, can also be super valuable. So not waiting for something to occur or using an injury classification around the severity of an incident or a potential incident is actually using the potential consequence as a really good measure that is a little bit more relevant, I think, to some organisations around what's important, and that is often preventing fatal or some sort of catastrophic event. So in terms of coming up with something that's a little bit more valid and reliable, having statistically reliable surveys is a really good example of a valid and reliable metric. Again, not always going to be super predictive, depending on the nature of the tool. And for some organisations, it's opinion-based at a point in time. But again, a really great way to come up with some benchmark data and have a balanced approach in terms of how you're tracking around your health and safety performance. And then lastly, some lead indicators, again, depending on the nature of the lead indicator, whether they're enabling or a critical control, a really great way to be a bit more proactive in terms of measuring health and safety performance. And Adam, you're going to talk a little bit more a bit later around the difference between quality versus quantity, and moving from counting a whole bunch of data and actually using it to measure effectiveness too.
Yeah, and look, I particularly love this slide, Mark, because I think it's important. You know, the graph demonstrates exactly how to have a mix of KPIs that kind of let you assess the whole piece holistically. But I would like to share a story too, and just in case anyone looks at a business like JLL and thinks, well, they must be so mature because of the size of the business, I'm going to cure you of that now with a story of where we didn't necessarily get it right in this instance. So we have a kind of a knowledge sharing session with a bunch of senior safety leaders from different countries on a regular basis. And as part of that, we go through the most severe incidents that we've had in the time period between meetings, and we make sure we're sharing learnings from those across borders. Now, we had a month which might sound like it was a particularly safe month, because one of those incidents that was the most severe in that period happened to be a worker who was installing basically a pot plant inside an office, and as part of that installation jammed their finger and required a bit of first aid. And in our incident management system at that point in time, that came in as a medium severity incident somehow, and therefore appeared on the list. So looking at that, we did wonder how this could be that in a company like us, with the scale of our operations, that is one of the most severe incidents we've had. And we did some analysis of some of the near miss reports we'd had in the same time period. And of course, as it turns out, there was much more severe things going on. Workers working without full protection at great heights in some instances. We'd had a couple of near misses involving cranes. So things that honestly had the potential to be terrifying. So I guess that's an example of how focusing overly on one KPI can kind of lead to the exclusion of others that are in some cases more important. And obviously that's something that we're working to rectify. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of share that quick story there around, in this case, obviously factoring in all things. And for me, the most important thing is the situation before the incident and which one you prefer. And if you ask me as a safety professional, I'd much rather have a guy installing a pot plant on any given day than the conditions for an incident involving any kind of crane. So that's the piece around context that really matters when you're making these decisions.
Yeah, great, Adam. And I think that's an example of an unintended consequence where you might think the systems are in place to effectively monitor things, but if not done correctly, can have the opposite effect.
Exactly.
So look, just some more examples there of using that same application. So some more people on the call, you might want to go away and recheck the way that you're reporting things to regulators, how you're reporting things internally, and getting a good mixture of being able to report on actual consequence versus potential consequence, and how that might line up with the way that you actually describe those within your risk management and incident management systems. And we've got some examples there of some surveys. We use the Health and Safety Index, a statistically reliable survey that we've developed ourselves. And we've also worked with organisations in the past around other forms of both enabling and critical control effectiveness too. And we've got some more examples coming up in a second too, just to explain some other practical examples of what this might look like. So as you can imagine, there is probably a long list of examples of KPIs that organisations can use. Now, obviously, we want to make sure the KPIs that are chosen align with the strategy, but also align with the context of your organisation. So depending on the maturity of your business, where you are today versus where you want to be, you don't want to be starting off trying to shoot the lights out too quickly if you don't have the basics right first. So for many organisations, there's an acknowledgement around starting with the basics, refining that before you progress on to something a little bit more sophisticated. So just some really simple examples here. Recently I worked with an organisation and they were adamant that they wanted to continue to report on hazards as a counting mechanism. Now, I think fundamentally for some organisations it's a good starting point, but ultimately there's just an absolute long list of potential hazards organisations can report on that doesn't necessarily turn the dial in terms of the quality of the control and the effectiveness of the outcome as opposed to just counting the number of hazards that are popping up. Certainly promotes a nice reporting culture, but doesn't always shift the dial in terms of what's important around the actual quality of the risk control itself. Adam, did you have an example in your organisation where you may have started off with, I guess, some basic KPIs and progressed on from that?
Yeah, look, I actually have one later on, which I look forward to sharing as well. But a thought that I have on this particular slide is the importance of language and specificity. So when we talk about enabling controls, if I can give you a very generic example, if we're going to go and count against a specific hazard that, yes, we've got an exclusion zone in place, you might get 100% scores every time. But if you then start to define exactly what a great control looks like, and it might be a physical barrier, or, a greater level of detail around exactly what a high quality control looks like in that instance, you will actually get richer data around, which operations are able to implement better level control measures and actually embody the intent of what that control was supposed to achieve. So, again, the importance of language in this and being specific and measurable around exactly what it is we're talking about.
Brilliant. So now that we've spoken about the difference between an OKR, a KPI, and how they might relate, we want to now progress this on to giving a few more practical examples of how you could both apply those with respect to measurement and also reflect on how you could learn and improve from those two. So Adam, I appreciate we're sort of running out of time. Did you want to sort of move straight into some of the examples that we've provided?
Yeah, look, absolutely. We've spoken a little bit about this calculator being now retired. But just to kind of summarize this slide, guys, I think this is a call to action from industry for us to think a bit more expansively and progressively around what safety looks like in our organization. There's a couple of wonderful little anecdotes on the SafeWork website about why this has been retired. And if I was to distill the intent of that, and actually a direct quote is from SafeWork, there's limitations when the LTIFR is used in isolation to measure WHS performance. So that's the view straight from the top, that LTIFR is not the answer. You may still need to record it. Certainly in JLL, we still know what our frequency rate is, and we need to disclose that to clients and in various reporting that we're required to do, but it's not a measure.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adam. So, we've got this little this box here of a spectrum of KPIs, both reactive through to proactive, and based on your level of maturity. So what we're going to do now for the last 5 or 10 minutes is just go through some examples. This is a really good example of some work that actually Catherine Wright, one of the return to work consultants we use, supported an organisation through a better claims management. And although this is a very reactive measure, I think if you've got a balanced scorecard, it actually tells a really cool picture, particularly for the bean counters and those people that are interested in money, is that if you get the strategy right, you can actually see a great reduction directly, not only in the reduction of claims numbers and costs, but actually some really practical measures that help injured employees get back to work quicker into being a little bit more, I guess, doing more meaningful work that's important to them as opposed to being on a return to work plan or worst case scenario, not working at all.
Yeah, this is a great metric, Mark. I've always been jealous of people that can use claims as a metric. I'm yet to work in an organisation where we've been able to use this and tell a really great story. But there's two points to make on using this as a particular metric. The first one is this is outcomes and impact on human lives in relation to injuries. So it's directly, related to our purpose as a profession. But like you alluded to as well, there's a financial impact, which, as you said, is obviously great for the bean counters in the business, and they're always critical stakeholders for us in terms of approving budgets or seeking investment. So if you can find a metric or an outcome that your performance is impacting that then supports some of those other aspects of business, it's great for your future engagement with your stakeholders.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think for some organisations, as they do start to improve their health and safety performance, the richness of lag data, be it claims or injury rates, become less and less. And the ability to rely on that becomes less and less. So having alternative measures, particularly those proactive ones, really is a great way to progress. So rather than having the same metrics year on year on year, ideally, our organisation should be looking to progress the way that they measure health and safety performance as their health and safety performance categorically improves. So I'll let you explain this one, Adam, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and it follows from exactly what you were just describing. So I'm pleased to share an example straight out of JLL. So what you can see in those two graphs along the bottom there, assurance activities by year, and then opportunities per activity, it's actually some of our own data. So a couple of years ago, around 2020, 2021, we weren't getting as much engagement in the system as we wanted. So naturally, as many of us would have done, and I'm sure many on the call have been in that situation, we embarked on programs around increasing engagement, getting people out to sites more, engaging with the system, completing activities. And it was great. We had a really successful turnaround in terms of getting that engagement. But that also gave us some different metrics to look at. So as we started to invest in the technology and make it more accessible for our people and get them out to sites more, what we saw was a huge increase in the number of inspections, but not necessarily an increase in any outcomes associated with that. So by percentage, we were doing way more inspections, but we're getting a lot of tick, 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 no problems. So that led us to then say we need to focus more on the competency, because when people are going out, we want them to have the ability to actually identify the issues and make sure those things get addressed and closed out and the improvements are realized on the site. So this isn't something we broadcast. I do want to make that clear. We did not communicate to the business that we were setting any kind of target around raising observations because we were concerned about gamesmanship in terms of the data. But what we did do is a huge program of competency building. So we had some SMEs come in from various suppliers and industry leaders in terms of risk control in certain areas to demonstrate to our people what best practice can look like and give better examples of things to look for when you're out doing these inspections. And that's what you're seeing in the bottom right there is this huge growth in opportunities we're identifying per inspection, which was a measure for us. That was a key result out of that objective. It gives us a sense that our people are competent and these activities are worth doing. And it's also a key measure that we can share with our clients to say, this is part of the experience with JLL, that you have competent project managers going out and finding and realizing opportunities. So yeah, I guess that's a story of how we started with one measure, but over time it matured. We gained better insight. Good performance in one area led to a better understanding of how we could continue to improve in other areas.
Yeah, super interesting. Not only in terms of that progression and improvement, but no doubt the fact that the people are identifying and acting on those opportunities. You'd like to think that's going to progress and actually continuing to improve your general health and safety performance ongoing too.
Yeah, correct. Exactly. And that's exactly the outcome we intend to drive.
Yeah. So here's a really good example from our friends at Risk Talk. So for those people that don't know Risk Talk, I'm not going to pretend to do Risk Talk justice here with an explanation of what they do, but for those people that are familiar with a task-based risk assessment or a Take 5, often it becomes a tick and flick and doesn't add a huge amount of value. Well, there's missed opportunity at least in terms of adding value. The guys at Risk Talk have developed some really cool voice technology where they do a task risk assessment using voice. And the outcomes of that voice-enabled risk assessment is then tracked and recorded in the system and provides meaningful insight to the frontline operations in terms of managing risk on a day-to-day basis. So I know for me, I'd much rather have a conversation around my immediate environment than sit there with my head in a checklist and ticking a whole bunch of boxes. But what's really cool around this is that when Adam spoke about the beauty of progressing from counting quality versus quantity versus quality, the challenge for many organisations is the admin that sits behind that. So what Risk Talk have done is not only simplified the life for the frontline operator, but they've also got some really cool AI-enabled metrics that they can capture from that around both the quality of the actual conversation and the impact that's starting to have on the actual task risk assessment themselves. So you can see here they've got some really cool metrics around the actual task risk assessment being amended. So it actually means that by having a conversation, it's actually adding value. If you're doing a task risk assessment, you're not just ticking the box and changing anything. They were able to demonstrate that the task risk assessment is actually having a meaningful, valuable change to the way that the operations are being run. And the feedback they're getting from that through technology enables, I guess, organisations to effectively see that the actual task risk assessments and starting to add real practical value on a day-to-day basis. So moving on to some other examples here, we spoke a little bit about quality and control effectiveness. Here's an example, having worked with an organisation that will be able to show that the number of safety violations tracked down as the number of critical control checks tracked up. So there was a positive correlation between those two activities. And although you might say that that's another counting metric, the fact that the safety violations are going down is a really good indication of the quality of the impact that's having. And the other one, very similarly, as the safety violations and high potential incidents came down, the number of critical control checks continued to improve as well. So you can start to see that you can use various data in ways that help tell a story, and hopefully a positive one at that.
Yeah, look, I love correlation, Mark. If I can share another example from JLL, I spoke about how we had to go on this journey of increasing engagement in our management system. And one of the interesting correlations of data we had at that point in time is that there was a direct link between the number of senior leader engagements with the number of engagements from their team. So where we had senior leaders that were doing more engagement activities, there was just a natural higher percentage of their team that were doing the same thing. Yeah, that was a great measure for us for many years.
Yeah, brilliant, Adam. So we'll continue to provide a few more examples based on, I guess, some of the things we've spoken about already. Here's an example where BSA Limited, who've used the Health and Safety Index now for about 3 or 4 years, are starting to report on the outcomes of that to their shareholders as part of their AGM. So, just another example where you can use traditional indicators along with things that are a little bit more proactive to benchmark your performance over time, but also compare that to other organisations externally as well. And then lastly, some organisations refer to this as maturity assessments. We tend to use the word performance assessment. So depending on the maturity of your business and where you are and where you want to play, we use a combination of surveys and other inputs to track how organisations are performing across a spectrum of different pillars on health and safety around what the observations are of the people and the observations of the systems as well in terms of trying to track improvements over time. So again, just another example of some things you can use in a balanced scorecard.
Yeah, just wanted to jump in, Mark, and say that I fully support the use of a performance framework like this. And one of the key reasons why is it helps you at the very beginning. And we spoke at the start about how strategy is making decisions. This helps you make some decisions based on the framework around where you need to start. And it also gives you something aspirational to aim for as you go on the journey. So absolutely great measure to start off with if you're at the beginning of your strategy journey.
Yeah, so it's a nice feedback loop in terms of a good starting point. And then hopefully not only informing the strategy of where to play, but then a nice indicator over time on how things are progressing. So all these metrics and measures are great, but it's also important to stop and reflect on what you might want to do more or differently. So for some organisations, it's important to track and use these indicators, and if things aren't going well, understand why. Some examples of perhaps refining the way that you work and your work design can be because of the organisation being too long or too difficult. The deadlines may not be right, or the expectations might not be clear too. So again, these metrics are an indicator, but only useful unless you do something meaningful with it. So, Christina, the last poll for today, some feedback from the crowd.
So the chat box has actually been popping off. So this will be interesting to see what everybody thinks about. But the poll to wrap up today's session is, what part of today's webinar did you find most insightful? Was it the chat around OKRs, KPIs, or measurement to learn and improve? While everybody's filling that out, I just want to spotlight a few little things that have been happening in the chat box. Jovan, mentions, how about evaluating, measuring the organisation's skills, capability and resources to enhance safety of work? A few people have then gone on to say, really great question. And in response to that, has said some organisations may use Gallup's Strengths Finder method to allocate resources / capability in the right area of the business, which is really interesting. What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, look, I think as part of building capability, competency and skill is super important. Adam spoke a little bit about training and the importance of how that sort of ties into some specific activities that they're trying to improve. The Gallup survey, I think I've used the Gallup Strength Finder myself as a leadership activity in terms of understanding where my strengths lie. So yeah, I think all those sorts of things are great if used in a nice balanced way.
And Philip then goes on to say, what gets measured gets either managed or manipulated or both. The challenge is to measure things that, even if manipulated, works towards achieving your KRAs, which quite a few people have loved or agreed with. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I guess it's one of the things that we spoke about at the start too, around ensuring that the KPIs align with where you're going as an organisation and your strategy. So yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Sorry, go on.
Just to jump in, gamesmanship will always be introduced. Anytime you're measuring almost anything, you're going to have various people trying to game the data. So I completely agree with set objectives that no matter what, they're still going to be positive for your business, because then no matter what, you're still having a good income, a contribution. But yeah, as much as you can, you try and establish rules around your data quality and your verification and validation measures so that you can put some authenticity around your measures as well. So yeah, a bit of both, but I completely agree with the sentiment.
And to wrap us up, the thing that most people found insightful for today's webinar was measurement to learn and improve, which came in at 59%, followed by OKR and KPIs coming in last. Is that something you find common?
Yeah, look, I think the example metrics, often people can get caught up in the theory really quickly. So having some practical examples of how to apply this obviously has been well received. So it's good.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, especially Adam and Mark. You guys have been incredible. Up on your screen now, you will see some accelerator course tiers that you can go into from FEFO Consulting. I know they are an incredible asset to anybody that's interested. Do you want to add anything to those, Mark?
Well, look, we've got some opportunities for people to get some support if they need it. So yeah, feel free registering your interest if you like. I'm more than happy to work with organisations to help them with where they're going with their strategy and trying to achieve their goals too.
Amazing. Okay, so that wraps up our third and final session of the Strategy for Safety webinar series with FEFO. Again, Adam, thank you so much for joining us. Mark,
Thank you.
You are incredible as always, and all of your insights and tips and tricks are invaluable. So thank you so much. The session today has been recorded, so I'll pop that into an email for you all this evening. There'll be links to all of the QR codes as well as that spreadsheet that you weren't able to download. So we can add that in there for you as well. So make sure you get that. If you want to reach out to either Adam or Mark, I know that they're always around and happy to help. So please do that. And if you have any questions whatsoever, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Again, thank you so much for everyone joining us, and we'll chat to you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.